Welcome to Lab Module Number 8, Acoustic Properties of Wood by Resonant Frequency Measurements. In this lab module, we will be studying the acoustic properties of wood. We will be using a wood marimba, a percussion instrument, to examine the effect of geometry on a given wood on the frequency generated by striking the wood. Following that, we will be making measurements of the elastic modulus and the acoustic dampening behavior of different woods in order to understand how wood is selected to craft musical instruments. Before beginning the lab, I'd like to provide a little background on wood itself. Wood is a composite material composed of lignin and cellulose. Lignin is an aromatic hydrocarbon structure in the form of rings that's responsible for most of the wood's properties. The cellulose component is a crystalline polymer based on glucose, and it forms a cellular structure that contains in the cavities of the cells the lignin. So the overall composite structure of wood is lignin-filled cells, where the cell walls are made of cellulose. Woods are classified as either hard or soft. Softwoods, such as conifer trees, are classified based on the structure of the cells in the conifer tree wood. Their structure is very uniform cell structures, and this type of uniform cell structure leads to a soft or more compliant wood. By comparison, hardwoods, such as flowering and broadleaf trees, have a variable size of their cells consisting of a mix of large and small cells, and the overall structure leads to a larger fraction of cellulose material, and this also leads to better packing in the cells and leads to higher hardness and higher modulus for these woods. The choice of woods for musical instruments depends on the way in which the wood is going to be employed in the instrument. In the case of the marimba that we're going to use in this lab, the choice of the wood is for a high impedance wood, such that the impedance has a large mismatch with the supports under the keys themselves. This mismatch allows the marimba keys to resonate when struck and not transmit that vibrational energy into the underlying structure. By comparison, we use wood to build instruments like violins, but the choice of the wood is rather different. In the case of the bridge supporting the strings and the top surface of the violin, these are made out of a low impedance wood. They're chosen specifically so that the vibrations of the strings can be very nicely transmitted through the bridge and through the top surface of the violin, so these components can transmit the frequency generated by the vibrating strings. The bottom surface of the violin body is made of a high impedance material such as maple. It's designed to reflect the sound generated by the top surface of the violin, so that the cavity between the top surface and bottom surface becomes the acoustic body of the violin, with sound being generated by the top surface into the cavity, and the bottom surface reflecting that sound back through the cavity. This is how you design the wood body of the violin to produce its unique sound. As mentioned previously, the marimba is a percussion instrument, which means that it's an instrument that produces its sound by being struck. The sound, in terms of pitch, is dependent on the frequency of the sound generated by the marimba key. When struck, that frequency is a function of the modulus of the wood itself and the geometry of the key and the support span across the back side of the key. The pitch is each person's individual perception of the sound, high or low, but is a rather subjective description depending on the listener's perception of the frequency. So pitch and frequency are similar, with frequency being the actual measurement of the sound wave, where pitch is a person's perception of that same sound wave. For the marimba, we want to make the keys resonate. In other words, we want to make the wood vibrate in a very narrow range of frequency. Each key has that resonant frequency tuned by the span length of the key. The keys are all made of the same wood, and the frequency generated by striking the key is then tuned based on the distance of the span supporting the key, as well as other aspects of the key design that would affect its geometry, mass, and so forth. Another property of the wood is the ability of the wood to either muffle or brighten a sound depending on the amount of sound that's absorbed in the material. In other words, a material where the amplitude decays very rapidly is absorbing the amplitude and will have a more muffled sound. Whereas a key that resonates for a long time, the amplitude decays more slowly, will have a brighter sound, similar to the ringing of a bell. So we're interested in having materials that will reflect that sound very well if we want to have a crisp, bright sound. Another aspect of wood that contributes to the pitch of the material and its reflection capability is the age of the wood. The older wood gets, the better it gets for musical tones. The sap hardens, increasing the modulus of the material, and the moisture content changes, typically reducing, which also increases the overall stiffness and hardness of the material. Some of the wood properties of interest for making musical instruments from wood is the density of the wood, with slower sound decay resulting from higher density. A higher density wood also makes them mechanically stronger, which is important for percussion instruments where you're going to be striking the wood. Too soft or too low density wood would result in indents being created after being struck. The modulus of the material, or the stiffness of the bonding in the material, and the constituent properties of the composite are important. Woods are highly anisotropic with respect to their grain structure. When a tree grows, the grains of the tree grow along the length of the trunk, and so the wood has a very high aspect ratio between the grain structure and the direction the trunk grows versus orthogonal to it. The property of wood are very dependent on the direction of that growth, parallel to the tree trunk or perpendicular to it. This is easy to demonstrate when you try to cut up wood. If you take a large trunk of a tree and try to cut it with an axe, cutting it perpendicular to the length of the tree is very difficult. It requires an enormous amount of chopping to break through the wood in that direction. However, if we take a section of the tree trunk and stand it so that the cross section of the tree trunk is parallel to the surface of the ground, and now you take an axe and strike it in that direction, you can often split the wood in a single blow. This is due to the change in the orientation of the grains with respect to the direction that you're trying to apply the axe. Highly anisotropic properties. Those differences in properties also translate to differences in modulus values for the materials in these two orientations. Another property of wood of interest for the design of musical instruments is the Q factor, which is the resonant frequency divided by the resonant frequency bandwidth. That ratio is the Q factor. It's a measure of the frictional losses in the material. Another important property is the impedance of the material. That's the resistance to sound transmission. An instrument like a marimba requires a very high impedance wood, so the sound doesn't transmit to the support bars. The impedance is the square root of the modulus times the density. In the initial portion of this lab, we will be assessing the behavior of the marimba keys. Then we will move on to measuring the modulus and acoustic properties of a series of hard and soft woods, as well as those properties with respect to the anisotropic nature of the structure of the wood, using a technique known as the resonant frequency technique. We will study a total of 8 different types of woods, listed here: cedar, fir, pine, oak, alder, babinga, maple, and poplar. For 4 of these, we will test them in both longitudinal direction, the direction on which the grains grow along the tree trunk length, as well as perpendicular to that direction, in order to demonstrate the large degree of anisotropy in the properties of the woods. As mentioned previously, the properties of these woods, most important for using them in musical instruments, is the ability to tune the frequency at which they vibrate. Resonance is the ability of a material to vibrate or oscillate at greater amplitudes at certain frequencies due to the excitation or being struck. Objects possess a natural frequency at which they vibrate at a specific rate, referred to as being in resonance, due to an applied stimulus or being impacted. The resonant frequency depends on the material composition, atomic bonding, and so forth, as well as the material's geometry, size, shape, design, density, and so forth. These are the things that we can use to tailor the specific resonant frequency that you want to get out of a piece of wood. When we consider exciting the vibrations in a piece of wood, let's consider a simple plank of wood supported at 2 points as shown in this drawing, referring to those 2 points as positioned at nodes of the vibrating beam. The separation between those supports, defined as the nodes, having a length L separating them. When a plate of wood is struck, we can set up several different vibrational modes. We're interested in being able to tune the amplitude of the first flexural vibration mode. This is the one that's going to be the largest amplitude vibration, and it's the one that's going to define the resonant frequency, the sound, the pitch that we want to achieve out of a piece of wood. However, when the wood plank is struck, it has other modes of vibration available to it. And what we're interested here is to determine the frequency of just that first vibrational mode. That mode should have the highest amplitude, and we're going to focus on measuring the frequency of that first mode, as well as examining the decay behavior of that mode, its amplitude over time. Let's talk a little bit about the actual experiment of the resonant frequency technique. We're going to use it to calculate the elastic modulus of the materials. The technique uses a plank or board of the material, and it's supported by 2 parallel wires or supports separated across the length of the planks. The drawing here shows the way in which the vibration is going to be set up inside the plank when struck at one end in the middle of the width. The technique uses the introduction of a compression or sound wave produced by striking the material, and then the geometry of the board, location of the supports, and its modulus will determine the vibrational frequency. By measuring the vibrational frequency, we can calculate the elastic modulus using the material geometry and other factors provided. In the drawing shown here, this mode of vibrating is referred to as the flexural configuration. It's the mode in which the board will longitudinally flex most easily. It's the most compliant mode of the board. When the board on the two supports is struck at one end, it generates an acoustic vibration that emanates from the board. The waveform would have a shape shown here. When we expand the captured acoustic response on the left, and we expand the time scale, you can see the individual amplitudes of the sound wave and how the sound dampens out over time. We will be using this signal to measure the frequency, using the time between the peaks to determine the wavelength and hence the frequency of the wave. This will be done for the highest amplitude wave generated for that first flexural mode. Once again, the acoustic signal captured is the amplitude of the sound wave generated by the oscillating board versus time. In order to extract the frequency, we take that signal and perform a Fourier transform on it, converting the amplitude versus time data into amplitude versus frequency data. This allows us then to extract the frequency of the highest amplitude peak, the first flexural mode of the beam. Then, using the equation given here, relating the modulus to that resonant frequency, we can calculate the modulus of the material using the dimensions of the plank, the mass of the plank, and the frequency determined by the flexing of the board. There is a correction factor, that capital T, in the equation, which is a function of the thickness of the plate divided by the length of the plate. That correction factor is applicable whenever the length over the thickness is greater than 20. So this equation has certain limitations associated with the sample size. Therefore, the planks designed for use in this experiment have had their geometry chosen so as to satisfy the condition that the length is more than 20 times the thickness of the sample. You may recall from a previous lab where we talked about the acoustic properties of a bell relative to a material like lead. We described part of the unique sound that the bell makes is associated with the long time it takes for the sound generated by striking the bell to decay. The long, slow decay of the sound generated by striking a bell is part of what makes the sound so unique and pleasant. However, that sound generated is a function of the material properties, the density and the modulus of the material, and the geometry of the bell itself. So in order to really design wood for use in musical instruments, we're very interested in knowing what the decay of the sound behavior in the wood is. This decay behavior is defined by the decay half-time for that particular material. For the acoustic sounds that we'll be recording in this lab, we can measure the decay function of the material right from the data. If you recall, the data consists of the amplitude of the wave oscillating back and forth and the decay or attenuation of that wave over time. The slope of that fitting of the amplitude of the peaks is an exponential decay function. We can calculate that decay function from the data itself. So we take the data and we fit a curve to the peaks of the data itself to generate a curve. We then use a best fitting routine to determine the best equation that fits the data. The output of this allows us to extract the decay half-time. and we will use that data to compare the different woods and their different geometries. So far, we've talked about the use of this resonant frequency technique to measure the elastic modulus of the material, the value E. The technique can also be used to measure the shear modulus of the material by changing the configuration of the supports and the manner in which the sample is struck. If we take two supports, which in this case are the wires that sit under the sample, and we take those two wires and orient them perpendicular to each other, and place the sample centered over the cross between the two wires, then we set up a configuration which is referred to as the torsional configuration. In this configuration, if we strike the sample at one of the corners, we can set up a twisting type oscillation or vibration in the plank. This is a different acoustic response. The way in which the sample flexes is different. It's a twisting mode rather than the longitudinal flexing mode. From the measurement of this mode, we can extract its shear modulus. However, we will not be making this measurement in this particular lab, but I wanted to mention it here just to show you the versatility of this measurement technique. Okay, now let's look at the experimental setup in a little more detail. Here we show the setup for making the resonant frequency measurements. The setup is rather simple. It's a very rigid metal frame that has a total of 4 wires spanning the frame. On one side of the frame, the top surface, for example, there are 2 parallel wires. This side is used for the flexural mode measurements, the measurements for determining the elastic modulus of the material. On the opposite side of the frame, in this case its bottom, there are 2 support wires that are set up perpendicular to each other. By simply flipping the frame over, we can place the plank of wood across the wires either in the longitudinal flexural mode, set up where the wires are parallel to each other, or the torsional mode set up with the wires perpendicular to each other. The frame has a perimeter designed to support a microphone. This is a simple 20 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz microphone, and the output of that microphone is fed into the computer. The microphone is positioned so that it can record the sound made by the plank when struck. The data collected from the microphone is fed into our computer program, where we perform a Fourier analysis on it to separate out the different frequencies of that vibrating plate. We choose the frequency of the highest amplitude as being the resonant frequency. The resonant frequency is the frequency we're interested in measuring here for the longitudinal flexing of the plank. For the purpose of this laboratory assignment, we will only be measuring the elastic modulus, not the shear modulus, and therefore we will only be using the longitudinal vibration or flexural vibration setup, not the torsional setup. Now we will do just a short demonstration of the use of the resonant frequency technique for determining the frequency as a function of the orientation and the geometry of the sample. Here we show a plank of pine. This is the longitudinally oriented plank. In other words, the grain structure is along the length of the plank, and we're going to take that plank and orient it on the pair of parallel strings so that it's centered with the long length of the plank perpendicular to the strings and centered with respect to the span of the strings. The separation of the spring-supported wires is determined based on the size of the plank. So we set the span difference, the separation between the wires, based on the geometry of the plate. we set that separation using the rulers that are along the edge of the frame, and we position the two wires such that their separation matches the value shown here. We then place the plank centered on those two wires and set up the microphone so that it's attached to the frame and the microphone is positioned centered above the plank. When ready, we enter the geometry of the plank into the software tool and then set up the tool to begin recording the sound. We will record for 5 seconds. So from the time we press the record button, we have 5 seconds to record the sound made by striking the plank. The data that's recorded is the sound amplitude as a function of time, which generates an acoustic signal that shows the amplitude decaying over time. We then pick that acoustic signal and we convert the amplitude versus time signal using a Fourier transform into the amplitude versus frequency spectrum. Then, using the software tool, we find the frequency associated with that peak, and that frequency defines the frequency of the first mode of vibration of the plank. From that data, we can calculate the elastic modulus. Following the measurement of the elastic modulus, we can take the data and examine the window of the frequency obtained and determine the decay function corresponding to the reducing amplitude of that signal as a function of time from that decay signal. We can then extract the decay half-time. In addition, we can obtain the frequency range of the peak, defined as the full width at half maximum value of the peak, and use that measurement of the minimum and maximum frequencies on either side of the resonant frequency, and use that data later to calculate the Q factor. Now let's start the first portion of the lab itself by measuring the acoustic response of the marimba keys themselves. The purpose of using the marimba in this lab module is to demonstrate the resonant frequency of each key, which depends on the length of the bridge span or the distance between the supports. Each key is made of the same high impedance material, but the frequency of the sound created by striking the key is tuned first by the span difference across which the key is supported. In this portion of the experiment using the marimba, the resonant frequency and decay half-times of the wood keys of the marimba are going to be recorded over an octave from low C to high C. We will begin by measuring the resonant frequency of the low C key. This is the lower frequency of the two C keys on the marimba. So this one is where the span length is the largest, which leads to the more compliant distance in this octave and results in the lower frequency. We set up the microphone above the key on the marimba, and then we're going to strike that key at the edge in order to cause it to resonate. We will capture that sound with the microphone and record it into the software tool designed to be able to examine the captured acoustic signal. Prior to beginning the recording of the sounds created by each marimba key, the keys were removed from the marimba, measured and weighed, and then reinstalled in the instrument. This allows us to have data input to the keys for the keys in the software tool. Now we show the analysis of the data. We collect a signal from the key after being struck. That captured signal is in the form of an acoustic signal with a rapid decaying amplitude as a function of time. So the largest amplitude is on the left side of the signal, and over time, moving to the right, the amplitude decays. The time scale for the decay is rather quick overall, but we can expand that time scale to see the individual peaks. We now take that signal and we apply a Fourier transform to it in order to convert the amplitude versus time into an amplitude versus frequency spectrum. From that conversion, we get a signal shown here where there's a single large peak associated with the single amplitude, the single frequency of that signal. We can zoom in around the peak in order to find the frequency associated with the highest point of the peak. Once the peak frequency is determined, that's the resonant frequency of the key. In addition, we can look at the decay of the amplitude as a function of time, and we use our fitting routine for the exponential decay and extract from it the decay half-time, which is a measure of the rate at which the decay is occurring. In other words, for a key to have a really long pitched sound, we want the decay to be very slow. We want the sound to resonate over a long period of time. We can determine the decay half-time from this software. To reduce the time of this video, we will show the measurements for 3 additional keys, E, A, and high C, but we will include the results for all 8 keys in the octave at the end of the video. The process for measuring the resonant frequency and the decay half-time for each key is the same. We simply move the marimba to position each key under the microphone. We strike the key to record the acoustic sound generated and apply the same procedure for the analysis of the data. We'll now show you the measurement results for keys E, A, and high C, and we'll summarize all the results at the end. Here we show you a table of the results of the resonant frequency and decay halftimes for the 8 keys in the octave of the marimba from low C to high C. You will see that since the wood is the same wood for every key, and only the thing that changes is the span distance across the key, the resonant frequency goes from about 1,000 hertz all the way up to 2,200 hertz over those 8 keys. You'll also notice that the decay halftime is relatively short for these keys, ranging on the order of 0.17 seconds, but relatively unchanged across all the keys. Now we will move on to the measurement of the planks of the 8 different materials, 8 different wood samples, in order to extract the actual modulus values and to look at the decay halftime differences among these 8 different wood types. We will also be examining 4 of these woods in both longitudinal and transverse orientations of the grains with respect to the plank geometries. To begin the measurements on the wood planks, we need to collect the data for the density and geometry of the planks themselves. Again, we will demonstrate measurements for a few of the wood plank samples, and then we will include all of the measurements of the data summarized at the end of the video. The data consists of measuring the geometry, the physical dimensions of each plank, followed by weighing the plank to get the mass. This will be demonstrated for several of the planks here, and all of the data will be summarized at the end for the rest of the planks. In this portion of the experiment, we will now be performing the resonant frequency measurements in order to calculate the elastic modulus, the Q factor, the impedance, and the decay times for all 8 materials. We will be comparing those results for the 8 different woods used in the flexural geometry setup of the resonant frequency measurements. In addition, these properties will be compared for 2 orientations of the wood grain for 4 of the 8 wood types. Here again we demonstrate the acoustic measurements for the pine longitudinally oriented grained sample. We begin by placing the pine plank, this is the longitudinally oriented sample, across the parallel wire span of the resonant frequency setup. These are the 2 wires that are parallel to each other and separated by a distance defined by the plank geometry. The separation of the wires is made and aligned using the rulers across the edge of the frame that are spanned by the 2 wires. Once the distances are set, the plank is centered over the 2 wires, and the microphone is moved into position centered above the center of the plank. Then the plank is struck by the hammer on the center of the width at the end of the plank in order to set up a longitudinal flexural mode vibration of the plank. That acoustic signal is captured by the microphone, fed into the data acquisition system in order to be able to convert the amplitude versus time signal into an amplitude versus frequency signal. A Fourier transform is used, extracting then the frequency of the peak with the highest amplitude. We use that to determine the resonant frequency of the plank within the software tool. Then we take that resonant frequency along with the geometry and the mass of the plank and can convert it into the elastic modulus of the plank, utilizing the equation provided earlier in this video. Once the modulus is determined, we can apply the same fitting to the decay of the amplitude versus time peaks in order to extract the decay half-time for the particular plank. Once again, in order to reduce the length of this video, the acoustic measurements for just 2 of the wood types, pine and oak, will be presented here for both the longitudinal and transverse orientations of their grain structures relative to the length of the boards. The data for the alder and cedar woods in both orientations, and for the bobinga, poplar, fir, and maple woods in the longitudinal orientation will be provided at the end of this video. Now we will perform the measurements for the longitudinal pine wood plank. The dimensions of the plank are input into the software interface along with the mass of the sample. Once the data is input, the sample is positioned on the wires and the microphone is positioned centered over it. And in the software tool, we can set up the record function, which is going to record the sound generated by the strike of a small hammer against the wood plank as the wood plank begins to resonate. After the acoustic signal is captured, the amplitude versus time signal is converted into an amplitude versus frequency signal, and that signal is then used to find the highest peak position of the amplitude of the peak in order to determine the resonant frequency associated with that highest point. Once the resonant frequency is determined, then the modulus of the plank can be determined. And then we can move on to measuring the decay function, the drop in amplitude of the acoustic signal as a function of time. By fitting that decay function, from which we can determine the half-life, we can determine how absorbing or reflecting the behavior of the wood is of the acoustic sound. We will also be determining the min and max values of the full width of half maximum positions on the frequency spectrum on either side of the resonant frequency. That will define the frequency bandwidth to be used to calculate the Q factor. Now we show the measurements for the pine wood sample, but in the transverse orientation. The growth direction of the grains of the tree are aligned along the width of the board in the transverse direction, so that the grains are oriented perpendicular to the long length of the plank. The procedure is the same. We enter the dimensions and mass of the board. We set up the sample on the wire support centered between the two wires and align the microphone on the center of the board. Strike the board at the midpoint along one end and record the acoustic signal. We then apply the Fourier transform to the signal and complete the rest of the analysis. Take a moment here just to notice that when the Fourier transform is completed, you can see multiple peaks. The highest amplitude peak down at the low end of the frequency range is the peak we're interested in. But you can also see that the second mode and third mode of vibration, those peaks at higher frequency, are also present. Again, we're interested just in the peak associated with the highest amplitude, the mode 1 flexure of the plank. We determine the amplitude of that particular peak by zooming in on it, the peak itself, and then determine the frequency of the peak's maximum amplitude. We use a cursor to identify the peak position, click on the peak, and the frequency is displayed. And you can see here that the frequency is 310 Hertz. We calculate the modulus from that, and we end up with a modulus of 0.34 gigapascal. We're also then going to define the peak with the half maximum frequencies of the peak on the left side and right side and record those values. Those values define the bandwidth of the peak. We also can establish the decay half-time from the analysis of the amplitude decay or the attenuation of the signal as a function of time. In this case, we've determined the decay half-time to be 0.0274 seconds. Here we present the data for the wood plank dimensions and weight measurements for all the wood planks from which we've acquired acoustic signals. For the woods analyzed in this lab, 4 of the woods had measurements made for both the longitudinal and transverse orientations of the grain structures. These are for pine, oak, alder, and cedar. 4 other woods had only their measurements performed for the longitudinal orientation. In the data collected, the samples have been measured twice in order to get the average behavior of the planks. So their measurements were repeated twice for each board in each orientation. The data for all these measurements from these boards are shown in the next table. For the first table of data, you are to compute the density, convert the density to kilograms per cubic meter, and then use those values to calculate the remaining parameters for each measurement. Questions to be addressed in your report. Compare your values of the modulus for each wood and for each orientation with literature values or values found in a database. In one appendix to your report, plot the following. The necessary equations to calculate these parameters can be found on page 5 in the lab manual. 1. Plot the elastic modulus E versus density. 2. Plot the sound velocity versus density. 3. Plot the flexural decay half-time versus the Q factor. And 4. Plot the flexural decay half-time versus the radiation ratio R. Question: from these plots or maps, describe any trends observed for the different woods. What parameters do you find to be most distinguishing among the ones calculated? Explain why you think those parameters would be useful, for example, in the tuning of a musical instrument. In this final lab report, there will be additional weight given to the special appendix. In the special appendix, address the following topics. Question A: with which scale did the marimba that we tested align in regards to frequency and tuning? Use the website link found on page 8 of the lab manual to help in this question. Question B: how do you think the marimba wood keys are tuned? In other words, if the key doesn't initially achieve the frequency desired, how might the manufacturer tune the key to achieve the desired frequency within the scale? Question C: rank the 8 woods, with 4 having 2 different geometries, from best to worst for the design of a marimba based on your evaluation of the data. Remember, a marimba requires high impedance so that there is a large impedance mismatch between the wood keys and the supports below them, so that no losses occur at the supports. Compare this design of the marimba to the soundboard of a piano or a violin, where the purpose of the wood is to transmit the sound from the strings to the air or to the wood. For example, which woods in this experiment would make good soundboards? Comment on and explain the anisotropy differences you observed in the 4 woods used in this lab where both orientations were measured. As a thought experiment, explain how one might use these differences in the properties of these woods to design, for example, a guitar using just one single type of wood. The end. Good luck.